All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for participating in this webinar. This is our first of two webinars we will be doing on the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. And for this particular webinar, we equity, racial equity, and how it applies to the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. My name is AJ Welton, and I am the Associate Director for the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, housed at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I'm also an Associate Professor in the Department of Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership. And I'll go ahead and let the co-presenters go ahead and introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Francina Turner. I'm a PhD candidate in Education Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the U of I, and I'm also a research associate here at the Office of Community College Research and Leadership.
Hello, everybody. My name is Angel Velez. I am also a PhD candidate in Education Policy Studies and also a research associate at the Office of Community College Research and Leadership.
And hello, I'm Marcy Rocky. I'm a project coordinator at OCCRL, and I work primarily with our initiatives that support the scope of work for Illinois community colleges through the Illinois Community College Board.
Okay. So just to give you a little background about OCCRL and our mission, OCCRL researches and studies policies, programs, and practices designed to enhance outcomes for diverse youth and adults who seek to transition to and through college to employment. And we have 4 key areas that we focus on in our research and advocacy work. First is public engagement, and so doing this webinar is an example of our public engagement. We also provide professional development for community colleges, and we have a continuous improvement program called Pathways to Results, and that's also one key way in which we engage in public engagement. Also on transformative leadership, so we're not just about producing research, but we're also about enhancing and improving and growing the leadership in the state of Illinois. That's very important to us. Equity-driven change is one key component. I should say that this should actually be in the center of this, this graphic, because all of our work that we do is equity-driven, and we lead by an equity lens. And then comprehensive P20 educational pathways. Although community colleges is part of our title as an organization, as a center, we consider ourselves a P20 focused research center. And so we very much so look at the entire educational pathway. Some key objectives for this webinar, we already introduced ourselves, but we will briefly give you some background information about what is the CLNA process, the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. And because this is an equity-driven comprehensive local needs assessment and a key piece of the Perkins 5 legislation and the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment, and this is coming directly from the federal government, is that this policy and this process and the implementation of Perkins 5 and the CLNA be equity focused and equity driven. And so we thought that it would be important to spend a good part of this webinar unpacking what is equity and also some other key related concepts to equity: systemic equity, race and racism, racial equity, and then we'll spend some time breaking down each component of the CLNA and how the core concepts related to equity and racial equity tie to the CLNA and the Comprehensive Local Needs Assessment. So what is CLNA? The CLNA is required by law under Perkins 5 with the reauthorization of Perkins 5, and it's completed biannually. All of you are engaged in program review, and how it's different from program review is that you engage in this biannually, and you're assessing all of your CTE programs, not just focusing on one. And the purpose is to facilitate a data-informed, continuous improvement process for CTE programs and programs of study. So this really should, like I said, a continuous improvement shouldn't just be looking, examining your data and assessing your programs over the course of 1 year. You really are continuously using the CLNA process to improve your practices. In the actual CLNA document, you should have received the document. ICCB should have sent that out to you. And each section includes suggested resources, and we are also in the process of developing a web page through our OCCRL website that will also have links to relevant resources for the CLNA process. And then the whole point of the CLNA is to help inform the development of your Perkins application. And the CLNA is supposed to be equity focused and driven. And we also would like to emphasize racial equity, because in working with community colleges throughout the state, no matter what your context is, we have found that race is the key equity issue that community colleges are often hesitant to address. And so, which is why we found it important for this webinar to really go over some key concepts and kind of break down and define what is equity and also what is racial equity. So there are 6 key components of the CLNA. It's focusing on student performance data, looking at the size, scope, and quality as defined by the state of Illinois' Perkins 5 state plan. Looking at how your CTE programs are aligned to labor market trends. Your progress towards implementing your CTE programs of study, as well as the recruitment, retention, and training of faculty and staff in your CTE programs. And then your progress towards improving access and equity for your CTE programs. And as I said before, in the CLNA document that you should have received from ICCB, at the end of each section, we provide a list of resources. And then what will you need to get started in completing the CLNA? Of course, an engagement from a diverse body of stakeholders. And Section 4 of the CLNA focuses on helping you think about whose voices are represented on your stakeholder team. You will need data, and you will need to disaggregate data, especially by race and ethnicity and other Perkins 5 special populations. And you will also need an understanding of what equity is and what equity means to your institution, which is why we're spending a good part of this webinar defining and helping you understand what equity is. Okay, so what is equity? I'm moving this part of the webinar on to Francina.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. Okay, we thought we'd start with explaining some of the things that equity is not. Equity is a way to get at equality, but it is not equality. Equality is the final goal. It's also not the same as fairness, and it's not all things being exactly the same. The way we look at equity acknowledges the myriad causes of inequalities, of inequities, and we'll discuss some of those a little bit later in the webinar. We do not all require the same supports, and insisting on providing all students the same supports creates further problems. Okay, what equity is, and especially in terms of education, is it's the process involved in achieving the ultimate goal of equality, as I said before, and it provides students with varied, additional, or differentiated supports that they need based on, it requires you to provide varied, additional, differentiated supports that the students need to achieve equality. And in order to recognize that there's an inequity issue, we have to think about what it means to be equity consciousness. And so equity consciousness is your awareness of the level of equity and inequity present in your institution or your departments or your staff's behaviors, policies, settings, organizations, and outcomes. So what you should be asking yourself is, how mindful and aware is my staff and my faculty about the unequal opportunities that exist here for students? Another key term that we need to talk about is deficit thinking. And so there are ways that when we want to look at equity or inequities in our institutions, we start by having very almost concrete beliefs about different populations. That's considered deficit thinking. So we might say something like, our fill-in-the-blank students always have a hard time getting into some program, or older students might not do well in math. Comments like, well, the good students always complete these programs, it's the bad students who don't. What we want to do is pull away from the kind of thinking that attributes inequity to personal failings or cultural differences, and start thinking equity-minded around things that we do have some power to control. So another question, a better way of looking at it might be, what are the processes involved into getting into a particular program, and how do our current processes affect our students by race or by gender or whichever equity subgroup you're taking a look at. Okay, in terms of looking at equity in relation to career and technical education, it just often includes a commitment to collecting the right kind of information, disaggregating it, and providing supports and resources based on the gaps or inequities in the data. It's essentially a commitment to achieving parity in educational outcomes. And again, to continue with equity in career and technical education, we're looking at ensuring equally high outcomes for all by distributing or redistributing resources, opportunities, and supports based on what students need to be successful. Removing the idea that one's race or culture will determine their outcomes, and interrupting inequitable practices, and intentionally examining both explicit and implicit biases. And that again is that piece around deficit thinking.
Okay, thank you, Francina. So the comprehensive local needs assessment is really pushing you to think about how inequity plays out systemically at your community college. And so to think about how inequity plays out systemically, you need to look at 4 different domains. So you're not going to get to equitable outcomes if you're just focusing on the policies and structures. You're not going to get to equitable outcomes if you're just focusing on our individual beliefs. You need to, when trying to address the problem of inequity, you need to look at all components of the problem. So you need to look at how our individual beliefs, so that could be our biases, stereotypes, could be creating the issue, the inequity. You also need to look at interpersonally, how we communicate to our students, how that impacts the inequity issue. Institutionally, in terms of our norms, our practices that we have always implemented. This is the way we do things around here, right? Those norms, status quo. How does that impact inequities and create inequities? And how does that impact certain student groups? structurally, and this is our programs, our policies, our structures, how are students navigating our institutions, and are there differences in terms of opportunities based on the structures that we create. So you need to be asking questions in all these different domains to get at the inequity issue. And the comprehensive local needs assessment and all the key questions that we have asked in each section of the CLNA helps get to each of these domains in terms of looking at equity systemically. So the first domain is individual. And this is our attitudes, our biases, our mindsets, our beliefs, our ideologies. And our ideologies and biases impact our practice. And we all have them, but we need to be aware of them, right? We all have biases, but the key piece is to be reflective, critical, and be willing to be aware and conscious of them, as Francina just pointed out with equity consciousness. So the CLNA process will help us be conscious of some of the attitudes and biases that may be negatively impacting certain student groups. Institutional, or as I like to call institutionalized, right? So I've been working at University of Illinois for 9 years now, and there's many ways I have become institutionalized. Like I have become accustomed to the norms of University of Illinois, and it's become habitual in terms of how I do my everyday tasks, my job every day, and that can be a good thing, right? Being institutionalized into the system can make your job easier. You have a flow in terms of how you do your job, but we do need to call into question our norms. Just the way we do things around here, the status quo. We need to question these things. And the reason why we need to question these things is because sometimes the way that we do things around here, and the way that we've done things, for years and years, might not be working for certain student groups, for certain subpopulations, right? And so we need to be willing to adjust and change our norms to better meet the needs of our students of color, to better meet the needs of students who are experiencing homelessness. So that is how inequities happen if we aren't willing to shift our norms to better align with what those students need, okay? That makes sense. And this single loop learning, this comes from organizational theory, and this is just demonstrating where we get stuck within our norms and we're unwilling to change and learn something new, learn a new practice in order to better meet the needs of our students. The structural component literally is the way educational institutions are designed. So the way we design programs, processes, policies sets students in a particular pathway or direction, right? In terms of their educational opportunities and their path for life. So those decisions that we make in terms of policies, practices, programs are huge for students because it is setting up the direction that they're going in and for life. And so it's a great responsibility when we are thinking critically about how the structures that we set up impact students, especially students who come from underrepresented groups, students of color. How are the structures that we set up impacting what they get access to and the opportunities they get access to? And then the interpersonal piece is literally how we communicate with one another. And each of these domains are connected and impact other domains within this system of equity. So the individual, our biases, belief systems, our ideologies can impact how we communicate with others, right? And so this example that here is a secondary example from a high school student, where this is a student of color who's realizing that her counselor didn't give her the same information as her white peers received in terms of AP course taking and taking the AP exam. So literally, using the CLNA process to help us understand how we're communicating with certain student populations, and is the information that we're relaying, the way in which we're building relationships with students, does it differ based on subpopulation? And how does that impact their experiences at the community college level? So these are just some examples in terms of the CLNA, how thinking about equity systemically, how the CLNA process will help you think about equity systemically. So from an individual level, challenging faculty, staff, and your industry partners that are working with you to question maybe perhaps some of the implicit biases that they may hold towards racial minoritized groups, and how those implicit biases may impact decision-making. Okay, so that's just one example of at the individual level. Institutional level, remember these are our norms. So how do our norms for recruitment deter racially minoritized groups from applying? So perhaps the way that we've always done recruitment, maybe it's deterring racially minoritized groups, students of color, from applying to a specific CTE program. Structural, how might our structures and practices push minoritized groups into low-wage CTE programs? So in what ways could we perhaps be tracking certain student populations into CTE programs that lead to low-wage jobs? And then that interpersonal piece, are faculty embedding culturally responsive instructional practices in the classroom? So are students of color able to see themselves reflected in the classroom, their culture and their identity reflected in the classroom discussions, the classroom curriculum, etc.?
Hello, everybody. I will now move us in a different direction, going from equity and systemic equity to what we call racial equity. Race and racism are obviously critical to engaging racial equity in CTE. First, I would like to start by defining a few key terms. Second, I will explore racial equity in a more general way. And third, I will place racial equity within the CTE context. I would like to say, just as a pointer, that the study of race and racism can take many years of study to understand. It is a very complex topic. So what I will provide is a snippet of the scholarship around notions of race and racism, as well as racial equity. Our hope is that by providing some definitions, it can clarify how it can be used within CLNA and the community college context. So what is race? Well, sociologist Omion Winon define race as an unstable category, social category that is constantly politically contested. Their definition is a little bit more complex, but comes to the essence of it. What this means is that race is a social construction. It means that race does not have a biological basis. There is no such a thing as different races in the biological sense. Despite some people trying to believe that race is a real thing in terms of biology, science actually does not support it. But what we actually know is that race is truly a socio-political construction that have real consequences in the life of racially minoritized groups. As you can see the definition by Eduardo Bonilla, he added that races are invented social categories that are socially real, and they are reenacted in the everyday life in encounters in all sorts of situations and spaces. So now we will move from this idea of what is race in terms of the social construction of it to this idea of racism. Um, Racism, according to Harrell, is a system of dominance. It's a system of power and privilege that is rooted in the historical oppression of subordinated groups that the dominant group views as inferior, deviant, or undesirable. The dominant group creates or maintains structures and ideology that preserve their power and privilege while excluding subjugated groups from power, status, and access to resources. Furthermore, racism, or as Bonilla Silva calls it, the racial ideology of a racialized social system, is actually the justification for racial inequality. So racism is the justification of racial inequality. Now I'll go ahead and talk about what is racialization, and this is a very important concept that sometimes we don't think about. So racialization is the process of constructing racial categories, applying these racial labels to them, to groups and practices, and then attaching racial meanings to these categories. So race is not a bad thing in itself. It's the labels that we attach to them, the meanings that we attach to resources, to cultural objects, to emotions, to bodies, and also to organizations like community colleges. So the process of racialization is required for us to understand in higher education as well. So for example, I'll give you an example. I think that Dr. Welton didn't touch upon it earlier, and she said that if we admit Black and Latinx students to CTE programs that lead to low-wage careers because we track the student in believing that they may not be capable of performing and completing these credentials. We'll go to the next slide. And I go into now from what is racialization to what are racialized institutions. We cannot comprehend racial equity without contextualizing the institutions in which this work is centered. Post-secondary institutions are not race neutral. In the US, there's a long history of race and racism embedded within higher education institutions. Thus, we cannot separate these two things. In the words of sociologist Victor Ray, colleges and universities are racialized institutions. Race argues that organizations are racial structures that reproduce and challenge racialization processes. So what is he saying with this? So what he's saying is that if we see organizations as fundamentally racialized, it also opens the questions about continuity and change in the racial order, because racial inequalities of organizations. So what he's arguing is to challenge racial inequities. So that's what we're trying to move us from a place that do not see or do not use race as a focal or central point to ensuring that we do to remove some of these racial barriers. So now that we know that organizations are racialized, sometimes the way we approach, or community colleges approach, or higher education approaches the study of inequities, or at least equity, is through a colorblind or color evasive racism. So he assumes that we're past race, right? Um, um, so if we listen to Victor Ray, he mentions, no, actually organizations, institutions are racialized. But sometimes the way we act within particular institution, we don't pay attention to race as a critical factor. So why is this important? Well, uh, this it allows us to see the centrality of race within institution. In a country where most racism is actually subtle and institutional and seemingly non-racial, we might believe that we are past race, right? But that's actually not the case. So in higher education, for example, we often hear that we must serve, I mean, quote, all students. But this does not account for the historical and contemporary ways in which race and racism impact people of color within these institutions. So the work on racialized organizations is essential here, because within these racialized structures, students, staff, and faculty of color often feel this invisible weight. So while institutions might have a willingness to be equitable, the experience of people of color are often hidden or go unacknowledged.
And Hel, can I add that oftentimes institutions, they avoid talking about race and instead focus on poverty, and feel like just focusing on poverty covers race, but they're connected, and you need to see how both are interconnected and related.
Absolutely, and that's a very critical point, because it's not only the socioeconomic status, it's not only your gender or whether you have different abilities, right? But it's also your race. All these intersections go along with these structures in what we call higher education, right? So thank you for adding that. So now that we understand some of these concepts, we want to move to this idea of racial equity. So Mucius, Ledesma, and Parker define racial equity as a systemic assessment of how racially equitable systems that uplift and increase access and opportunity for historically minoritized people of color, whoa, that's a mouthful, are equally ingrained into the academic and social practices, policies, and structures of an institution. So what does this mean? Actually, I will give you also a second definition before I go to what this means. So at the Center for Social Inclusion, for example, they define racial equity as both an outcome, but also they define it as a process. So as an outcome, racial equity can only be achieved when race no longer determines one's socioeconomic outcomes, when everyone has what they need to thrive, no matter where they live or they get educated. And as a process of racial equity is applied when those most impacted by structural racial inequity or inequities are meaningfully involved in the creation and implementation of the institutional policies and practices that impact their lives. So this is what this looks like. So I just came back from the 2019 Minority Serving Institution convening that just took place in Dallas. And the president of Houston Community College Eastside, Dr. Melissa N. Gonzalez, was there as a keynote speaker. She is actually very much want to engage the campus on racial equity. Most of the students there are students of color. So this is what she's doing. So she went in and she created multiple certificates that get Latinx and Black students interested in the college going process. So for example, she created a 2-day, 14-hour nationally accredited forklift certificate. Now, with this program, there's such a demand, there's a wait list. She actually partnered with industry partners to ensure that the students get a job starting at $16 an hour. She also created several semester-long level 1 certificates. I think she developed about 12 of those. But she wanted that the students of color, particularly Latinx and Black students, have the ability to enter college, even if it was just for a couple of days. Later, if they wanted to continue, at least these students will know what the process looks like, where to go, how to enroll. So she also has been proactive in listening to these students as well. So she created these kind of coffee conversations to talk to students and their parents about any questions they might have. So she's indeed being very intentional in engaging these communities and actually using them as a way to create programs and practices. Now we're going to apply this idea of racial equity to the CTE context, to the community college context. So as Dr. Welton was saying earlier, the study of higher education, also community colleges and CTE, often use this anything but racism approach to explain racial phenomena in post-secondary context. This means that race and racism are usually not named as the primary reason for racial differences, or when they are mentioned, they're not engaged critically or in detail. So when we look at racial equity within CET, we'll go to the next slide actually. We see that within even the research, right, which goes back to this point, that from 2005 and 2011, in this 7-year period, only 25% of the research on CTE describes race or ethnicity as a factor. Now, this can tell you how this idea of color evasiveness, right, color blindness, this idea that racial equity should not be central, you know, even within the research, we do see that as well. And one of the studies that examines racial data within CTE comes actually from Illinois. So this study by Hamilton, Malin, and Hackman found that there are gendered and racial disparities in CTE in the state of Illinois, primarily affecting women and Black and Latinx students. But given that community colleges are an important port of entry for students of color, particularly Black and Latinx students, racial equity must be front and center, and we must take race and racism into consideration when we research or work with these communities. So finally, why examining racial data in CTE is important? Well, first, it can dismantle historical and contemporary barriers that diminish the success of students of color in CTE. So by disaggregating, for example, data, we can see the gaps, and hopefully we can address those. So it can also shed light to areas of improvement. It can allow for the development of concrete goals to ensure students of color equitable outcomes. And it allows for everyone to enjoy the benefits of great CTE programs. So not only one group entering or going for this high wages, wage CTE program, but that everybody gets to enjoy them as well. And plainly, it makes the institution better. And I'll pass it back to Dr. Welton.
Okay, thank you, Angel. So we know that we introduced you to some heavy concepts, and we gave you kind of like a sampler, right? But as Angel said before, we hope that you take this information this foundational information back to your campuses and continue to discuss these concepts. Think of ways that perhaps you can develop professional development to help you continue to grapple these key concepts of equity, systemic equity, race, racism, and racial equity. Because if you don't take the time to unpack these concepts and what they mean for you and your campuses, you won't have the language or the background knowledge to help you assess your CTE programs, right, through an equity lens. So, continuous engagement and discussion of these key concepts are really important. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to break down each section of the comprehensive local needs assessment and highlight how some of the key concepts that we spoke about in this first half of the webinar connect to what you will have to do for the comprehensive local needs assessment. Okay. So section 1, progress towards equity and access. This is where you're really taking a bird's eye view of your CTE programs. And this is asking you to take a critical examination of your overall CTE programs with an equity lens to assess whether and how equity is systemically and systematically embedded in all aspects of your CTE programs, structures, resources, materials, curricula, pedagogy, and practices. So that example that Angel gave of that community college president, that is really, remember I said you're looking at all domains of systemic equity. So you're looking at the individual, the structural, so that was an example of how that community college president was really trying to make sure that they were looking at inequity in each of those components in terms of their structures, their materials, the pedagogical practices in the classroom, okay? So you're not just trying to fix the problem by looking at one small piece of this. You're looking at all components of the system. So some key questions that we placed in the CLNA that'll help you examine equity and access more systemically and systematically are: to what extent are your programs representative of your district's demographics and the shifts in diversity of your district? Okay, so this, no matter what your demographic makeup of your institution is, so if you have more racially homogeneous institutions, maybe you need to question why that is. Like, why is it that my student demographics in a particular program are more racially homogeneous? Are there certain reasons why perhaps we're not reaching out to certain student groups that are underrepresented? To what extent are program materials representative of your district's demographics and the shifts in diversity of your district, such as race, ethnicity, gender, age, socioeconomics, English language learners, or disabilities? So these are just some of the key questions that we have embedded in the CLNA that'll help you examine in terms of all key components of your CTE program, whether or not you're focusing on equity in each of those key components. And Marcy, I don't know if you have anything else to share or highlight in relation to this section in equity.
Sure. Just that this can really create an opportunity to engage people in conversations when you look at what your, maybe you have an environmental scan of your district and how that might be different from who is coming into your institution. And so it can create openings for conversations about that. And again, if you've had shifts in your districts, how are your systems and your structures, how were they created and who were they created to serve? And so it can kind of give you an opportunity to talk about how might we as an institution need to respond differently within our district to engage and to serve the whole district.
Section 2 is student performance, and this section will help you evaluate your students' performance on federal, state, and local measures and identify any equity gaps based on this data. And I would say too, to not just rely on, your federal, state, and local measures, but what are some, measures that you can design yourself to help you get a better understanding of how students are performing, how they're learning, their growth. So it's not just outcomes, but also student growth, trying to get a sense of student growth. So what are some assessments that, faculty and staff can create to get a touch point, get a pulse for how your students are learning and growing. And so some key questions that we embedded in the CLNA to get at equity in relation to student performance are: what equity gaps were identified for students in CTE programs for high wage sectors? And we emphasize high wage sectors. And we put this sub question for racial equity because, as Angel pointed out earlier, that we're finding in our work with community colleges across the state, and it doesn't, no matter your context, no matter where you're located across the state, right, that community colleges are reticent to really look at race and examine their racial inequities. And so we wanted to make sure that we embedded a sub-question that really encouraged you to look at race. And then also, what are some of the root causes for equity and racial gaps you identified in your CTE programs? And when we talk about root causes, this is to push you to not do the blame game stuff, right? So what Francina talked about earlier in terms of deficit perception. So when you are looking at your data and you identify an inequity, don't just automatically blame the student subpopulation. Oh, it's just because the Black students aren't interested, in this particular CTE program. Really try to be introspective and use the CLNA as an opportunity to examine, okay, what is it about our policies, our practices, our structures, even our belief systems about certain student groups that could explain why perhaps students are performing in this way, or maybe students aren't matriculating through this particular CTE program. And Marcy, I don't know if you have anything else to add for this section.
I think just also an opportunity to, as you're engaging stakeholders and you're looking at those entry points for students, so how are you creating entry points for different populations that are in your district, both in secondary, but also for adult learners, for adult education. So again, engaging stakeholders, and as Dr. Welton said, and Francina had talked about, not doing this blame game, but think about how you might prioritize change, and use your local application to do that, to engage stakeholders more effectively.
And just one final point in terms of student performance: if there's data that you're lacking, or you realize that you need to create your own assessments to get a sense of how your students are learning and how they're doing, perhaps that is a need that you identify through this CLNA process that you could outline in your local application, that you can use your local application to get resources to help develop assessments. Okay, section 3 is on recruitment, retention, and training of CTE educators. And so this section is really to assist you in evaluating current and future recruitment, retention, and professional development needs with both an equity and culturally responsive lens. And some of the key questions that specifically focus on equity and racial equity that we integrated in the CLNA are: how has your institution engaged employers in the recruitment of CTE faculty? So relying on employees or industry partners to help you recruit high quality faculty, but even more so, diverse faculty. So what groups are underrepresented amongst your CTE faculty by race, ethnicity, gender, and disability? And how is this underrepresentation of faculty reflective of the industry as well? okay? So this is why it's really important to work with your industry partners to make sure that students can see themselves in the faculty, that they can see representation of themselves in the faculty, right? Based on their race, based on their gender. Among your CTE faculty, how are you increasing representation of underrepresented groups, especially in terms of groups that are underrepresented by race, ethnicity, gender, and disability? And then, Marcy, you'll probably touch upon this in terms of professional development for faculty, if you want to add.
And even if, you know, sometimes these conversations are new, particularly within the realm of CTE faculty that might be coming, you know, from a trade or a skilled workforce, but they're transitioning into teaching, and maybe there haven't even been conversations about a homogeneous faculty and more diverse students, and what does that mean for the classroom? And again, how do you provide professional development to advance cultural competency, to advance implicit bias training so people become aware, and also how that influences the classroom and the pedagogy.
Yeah. So if you're recognizing that perhaps you need to provide more professional development for your faculty and staff on culture responsive practices, you can embed that in your application for local funding, or your local application for funding. Section 4 is stakeholder participation and voice. And there is a section in the CLNA document that asks you to list the stakeholders who participated in the CLNA process. And, you know, we hope that you are always, you know, engaging. You have a consistent stakeholder team or advisory group that you are, you know, always ongoing, having conversations with, meeting with, you know, biannually or whatever your system is, but you are, you know, consistently engaging stakeholders and including them in the development, design, the evaluation of your CTE programs. And so we are not asking you to like reinvent the wheel and come up with some separate stakeholder group for the purposes of the CLNA, but that you are, no matter what, engaging stakeholders in this process. But from an equity and racial equity lens, you definitely do, though, need to examine who is represented in your stakeholder group, okay? And are you especially getting representation from people of color on your stakeholder team?
And for those of you at the Forum for Excellence, if you were there, Dr. Williams from NAEP had mentioned, you know, thinking about this as an opportunity to again identify who might be missing from conversations. And if our advisory committees that look at our CTE programs are very homogenous and maybe have been, you know, the same people that we've been going to for a really long time, or even how are we meaningfully engaging our advisory committees in these conversations and reaching out to other stakeholders that may not be at the table or may have never been at the table.
Okay. Section 5 is on the labor market alignment. And so this section asks you to consider how your programs align with state, regional, and our local labor market needs and demands. And some of the professional development sessions that we've already done on the CLNA, we're learning that many of you might not have data, or you need data to help you look at labor market trends. So this could be one area where you include in your local application for funding that you want to use resources to get access to better labor market data. So some key questions that we embedded in the CLNA document to help you be reflective about equity and racial equity related to labor market alignment are: what have been emerging and are growing occupations in your region? And then from an equity perspective, what racial ethnic groups are not represented in these emerging and/or growth occupations? And what are some of the barriers for the groups you identified? So this is, like I said, from an individual perspective and from an interpersonal perspective. Maybe perhaps there are certain groups of color that you aren't connecting with. And so this is really pushing you to be reflective as to why. Among your CTE graduates, identify subpopulations that are experiencing inequities in the labor market. Explain what inequities and opportunities, institutional structures, okay, and resources may be the root cause. So this is really not playing the blame game, right? But being introspective about what are some, policies, practices, structures within the institution that may explain why perhaps there's inequities in the labor market, but also bringing in terms of your stakeholders, bringing in your industry stakeholders and helping them be introspective as well, and examining perhaps maybe there are practices and structures within the industry that are discriminatory or not opening up access and opportunities to certain subpopulations.
And as you have those built-in entry and exit points or stackable credentials, again, engaging in conversations of how do you advance educational attainment from certificate to associate degree, and you can engage employers in those conversations as well.
Section 6 is program size, scope, and quality. And the definitions that we provided in the CLNA document for you are based on the current state definitions for size, scope, and quality, but also based on federal definitions for size, scope, and quality. And we have been told by ICCB that these definitions will probably change, and so at some point, and so we will let you know when the definitions for size, scope, and quality change. But a key question that we embedded in the CLNA document to help you think about program size, scope, and quality through an equity lens is, how do your program offerings meet the needs of students and the communities that you serve, right? And how is it viable and sustainable? I don't know, Marcy, if you had anything else you wanted to add.
I think, again, just, looking at if you have an environmental scan or identifying any gaps in opportunity in terms of your district versus what's going on right now in your college.
And then section 7 is progress towards implementing programs of study. And this is alignment, right? Looking at the alignment of your program. So this section will help you determine whether and how, according to Perkins 5, your programs of study at the post-secondary level are coordinated, non-duplicative sequence of academic and technical content. And so, I always suggest that you really put yourself in the student's shoes and maybe collect some student perspective data, right? To understand how they are matriculating through your programs. So a couple of questions that we've embedded from an equity lens in the CLNA document are, how are you ensuring that you meet each student's individual academic learning needs and mastery of employability skills and readiness? So this is going back to what Francina said is the definition of equity, right? So you are really meeting each student's individual needs in terms of resources, in terms of interventions, meeting them where they're at in terms of their needs. What opportunities exist for secondary students in your program of study to earn dual credit or enroll in concurrently? And dual credit really is a leverage point in terms of providing equitable opportunities. And Marcy, I'll let you
Mhm.
add.
I think this is a really critical opportunity, again, to avoid, any sort of blame game, but to really partner with your district high schools and look critically at, where do you see dual credit programs? Where do you see opportunities to earn certificates in high school or to enroll concurrently, and who participates in those programs? And how might you, again, use your local application to advance opportunity as you identify gaps in opportunity by your feeder high schools. And so how can you partner to advance equity at the secondary level for those programs that we know can help students transition into college and earn credentials that can help them become employed and, again, continue on perhaps toward an applied associate degree.
And then finally, Section 8 of the CLNA is once you have gone through each section of the CLNA and asked some of those key guiding questions to be reflective and critical about your CTE programs from an equity lens. Based on that information, you're going to use that information to think through what are some of your needs that you need to flesh out in your local application. So this whole CLNA process is really to help you inform how you're going to prepare your local application. And as I said earlier at the beginning of this webinar, that the CLNA process is really meant to be a continuous improvement process. Are we asking that every 6 months that you fill out a whole new CLNA document? No, that's not what we're asking. But we do encourage you to, at minimum, every six months, revisit the CLNA document, revisit any other continuous improvement processes that you're engaging in, such as program review, and ask these key questions again. So which specific subpopulations are not being served well by your programs? So even if you started to implement some interventions and plans of action based on examining the data, you still need to go back and see, are there still subpopulations that are still not being served well, and why? And revisit what institutional structures and practices could still be creating barriers for these subpopulations despite the interventions and action plans that you've implemented, and in what ways could these issues be addressed immediately? And then which of the problems identified need a more comprehensive long-term plan? And then finally, based on you working with your stakeholder team to go through the comprehensive local needs assessment process, what are some priorities you need to make for your local application?
And as a part of this, as I know, ICCB had an event about program development and program review, and as we think about, program review being on a 5-year cycle, but that it's a best practice to really look at it annually and have this cycle of continuous improvement. That again, with the CLNA being over all of your CTE programs, that this can create opportunities to reinforce the need to really revisit these reports and revisit your data on a regular basis.
So what are the implications for your local application for funding? So basically, what are some things that doing this CLNA process could help you address in your local application for funding? So maybe perhaps as you're walking through the CLNA process with your stakeholders, you realize that you lack data on equity, especially race. Maybe you don't have enough data to help you understand how students of color are navigating your CTE programs, matriculating, getting access, and maybe your local application for funding, you can outline in your local application for funding that you need to do some capacity building work in terms of developing more sources of data that'll help you examine race. And these are just like some examples of things that your CLNA will help you do for your local application for funding. Perhaps you realize through your CLNA process, especially when you're examining the needs of faculty and staff, that perhaps your faculty and staff for your CTE programs need more professional development. I mean, that's great. We're providing you this webinar where we're introducing you to key terms, but maybe you're realizing that you need more work on equity and more work on understanding what culturally responsive means and what culturally responsive practices look like. And so perhaps you are going to put that in your local application for funding to provide more professional development. Maybe examining or building the capacity of your student support services. That's something that you realize you need to work on. Based on the CLNA process, you realize that your student support services could really be an area that could help you close those equity gaps by re-examining and improving upon your students, your wraparound student support services. Put that in your local application for funding. So the comprehensive local needs assessment, literally the word needs is in there. Like, what are your needs? What do you need to work on? What do you need to improve? And based on that, you can put that and apply for it in your application for funding. So this is not the last time you're going to hear from us. We have another webinar on Wednesday, November 6th, which I think is in 2 weeks. Time is flying by. And at this webinar, we're going to specifically focus on identifying equity, racial, and opportunity gaps. So this is where we'll give you some tips on how to examine data and identify equity gaps in your data. And then also you should have gotten some information from ICCB about an RFP for to get some additional technical assistance for the CLNA. And that is due October 24th, the letters of intent. And also, like I said, we will just please, check your email. And once we get our website up and running, we'll let you know. But we are planning on having resources and information available on our website that is going to be devoted to the CLNA. And then next semester in the spring, we're going to be doing some more hands-on workshops that are open to all community colleges to help you process and work through the CLNA, the program review, and those of you who are participating in PTR. I don't know, Marcy, if you want to talk about any of the future potential workshops that we're going to make available.
Sure. So we have, at OCCRL, we have several projects with that are funded through ICCB, and so we will have a professional development opportunity in this hopefully early to mid-spring semester that will be supporting people in the CLNA program review, pathways to results. And so that will be an open opportunity, and that is the event that's also named in the RFP for those colleges that ICCB selects for this technical assistance. That they'll be a part of that, but it'll also be open to other community colleges as well to attend these events.
Okay. And then finally, we just wanted to share with you our contact information. Marcy and I are the key points of contact for the comprehensive local needs assessment and any technical assistance you may need in the comprehensive local needs assessment process. Marcy, myself, and another project coordinator, Chadrick Galloway, we worked together to develop the comprehensive local needs assessment. And we also want to thank, we had several community college leaders from across the state who gave us feedback on the comprehensive local needs assessment. So and helped us develop the document. So thank you to all of you who helped us develop the comprehensive local needs assessment. But please feel free to email us if you have any questions. Also, if you have any requests for professional development needs or resources, like I said before, we are in the process of developing our website that provides resources for the comprehensive local needs assessment. So if there's any suggestions of tools or different things that we can post on the website, please let us know. Also, if you want to, we have on our OCCRL website, we also have a link where you can request customized professional development. So if that's something that your institution is seeking, please feel free to fill out that link or email us directly. We are always happy to provide professional development for CLNA specifically, but also any other initiatives that you're working on related to equity that we can come to your campuses and help you with. Is there anything else that my co-host would like to add?
No, I think you all did a great job with a lot of information.
Yes, I know we have given you a lot of information at this webinar. And please know that we recognize, especially working on race and equity, these are big, complex task, and so it will definitely take your institution's time to work through these issues, but don't do them alone. Do them in collaboration with your stakeholders. But we are all excited to roll up our sleeves and work with you in person when we do these different workshops in the spring and help you think through how the CLNA process can help inform your Perkins 5 local application. Just to let you know, for those of your colleagues who weren't able to attend this webinar, we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our OCCRL website, and we will send out an email letting you know when the link to the webinar is up and running. And we will also let you know when our website devoted to CLNA resources is up and running as well. So if one of your colleagues was unable to attend, or if you just want to go back and refer to the webinar, if there's something that we talked about or a concept that we introduced you to during this webinar that you still want to go back to and return to and reflect on, the link to this webinar will be posted on our website. Well, that's all we have for today. So thank you. We had I think we had a very good attendance. And so I appreciate all of you taking the time in your busy days, and you are busy people. And so I appreciate you taking the time to participate in this webinar. And stay tuned for our webinar. We'll be sending out information for how to register for our webinar on examining your data for equity gaps on November 6th. Thank you.